Dog frantically digs at grave and his owner couldn't believe what happened next. When Keto began to dig into the grave, Steven was at a loss for what to do. Even if he tried, she was too powerful for him to stop on his own. While calling the police on the phone to get assistance, Keto barked, causing the man to abandon his call. In her search, she had uncovered something. Steven peered over the lip of the abyss with trepidation. When he saw what Keto had discovered, his mouth fell open. It was obvious to Steven that he needed to contact the authorities. What Keto found in this cave. Simply put, he had no idea why it was even at this location. He had no grasp of its meaning. The cops, hearing his story, at first mistook it for a prank. When they got there to see it for themselves, they confirmed Steven's account was accurate. But no one could have predicted how far-reaching Keto's discovery would be, or how dramatic its effects would be. But at some point, this would inevitably occur. Dozens of people were taken into custody during the next couple of days. It was all because of Keto's discovery in the cemetery. Steven felt relieved he did not manage to prevent her that day. However, it is unclear what Keto discovered in the tomb. What made this discovery so pivotal that it resulted in so many arrests? Once a day, when Steven came home from work, the two of them, Steven and his husky, Keto, would go for a stroll. She had always been docile and kind, but as they approached a field one day, she began acting suspiciously. Keto was resisting Steven's grasp so vigorously that he was squirming. Steven wondered what it was that had drawn her eye. In an attempt to free himself, Keto broke free and began struggling violently against Steven. That was the first time in her life she'd ever done anything like that. When Steven let go, she rushed off down the alley. Even though he had no clue where she was heading, Steven was relieved that the region was seldom used by vehicles. He soon started to chase her. After his dog ran through 2 homes and an open field, Steven saw that she was headed in the direction of an old cemetery. As his unease grew, he took notice. Since a bigger, grander cemetery had sprung up on the outskirts of town, few people made the trip there anymore. Steven reluctantly followed Keto as he ran along one of the paths. As he had expected, the cemetery was deserted. Keto was clearly visible in the distance, but Steven was moving far too slowly to catch up to her. Flowers were placed on several of the graves as he gazed about. Indeed, he was taken aback by it. It wasn't like they were visiting any old graveyard. After all, the cemetery was once used as a military burial ground. Wooden crosses were used in place of headstones, making it more difficult to locate a specific burial without first reading the inscriptions. As he followed Keto and yelled her name, Steven couldn't help but wonder how other people managed to get about. There was an additional issue, too. The names on the little metal plates below would be visible to tourists on a clear day, but winter had settled in and a thick layer of snow covered the whole cemetery. There were just white crosses in the snow. For the time being, Keto's attention remained focused on the area immediately around them. Steven pondered what may be buried in the snow. Keto, nose to the ground while Steven watched, strolled between a line of crosses. Again and again she sniffled. She abruptly halted in front of a grave that proudly displayed a floral arrangement. Keto seemed frozen, as if she were about to flee. The dog hesitated for a second, then charged ahead, digging her paws deep into the snow. They scattered as she tore at the grave and shook the flowers. The image shocked Steven to his core. He ran over and grabbed Keto by the collar. However, Keto argued otherwise. Despite Steven's best efforts to stop her, Keto kept advancing toward the grave. To be honest, Steven wasn't much help against her might. Unlike a smaller dog, he couldn't merely pick her up and take her away. Steven, feeling ashamed, began searching the nearby graveyard for assistance. He was distracted by something. Steven saw a sign beside the entrance and figured the groundskeeper must be close by. He may explain that Keto had dug them up, make an apology, and perhaps even replant the flowers. To top it all off, he needed assistance in getting Keto's attention. To his dismay, a sudden bark prevented him from making it to the front gate. Keto was fixating on him, barking as loudly as she could and making no sense. Steven got her message despite her odd behavior that day. Keto's inquisitive bark was a surefire way to get Steven's attention whenever she wanted to share anything with him. Ascending the slope again, Steven resumed his journey. Just what did she unearth? Steven understood he should have contacted the groundskeeper and avoided the area out of respect for the deceased's right to privacy. Digging about in someone else's grave was very inappropriate. Keto, though, was so captivated by her discovery that Steven gave in to her enthusiasm. He needed to figure out what the dog's problem was. Keto had dug around the base of the cross, through the snow, and to the nameplate. She was waiting for Steven to come see the muddy hole as her ears were perked up. Steven approached and walked beside her. Steven almost fell backwards as he stared down the hole Keto had dug. He had never seen anything like that in a cemetery before. He looked at Keto in shock, unable to fathom how she could have possibly made such an incredible discovery. Steven struggled with his phone. He had to call 911 and report it. He didn't think Keto could have dug far enough in the frozen ground to find a coffin. But the reality was much more shocking than he had anticipated. It seemed illogical at best. Still certain it was a terrible joke, Steven looked over his shoulder once again. Steven saw there were holes in the nameplate as he reached the bottom of the shaft. The scope of it seemed to go much beyond what Keto had discovered. He examined the plate intently, illuminating it with the light from his phone. There was much more. Noises could even be heard through the gaps. Steven was at a loss to guess what they may be. He mowed down a patch of grass in front of the next grave with his foot. Keto joined in the digging as she realized his strategy. As expected, it resembled the first grave. A majority of the grave plates that Steven examined had holes in them. One, though, appeared perfectly typical. That one didn't have any flowers, he realized. A trend may have emerged. He dug a hole and went in search of another grave with flowers atop it. The findings stunned him. Steven saw the identical holes on the plate when he uncovered the grave with the bouquet. He was still trying to figure out what he was seeing and why before he phoned the police. All of the headstones at the flower-adorned graves had holes bored in them. It meant what exactly? Maybe these were ventilation holes for the cage or possibly the coffin underneath, Steven thought to himself. They seemed to go deep into the ground, with holes running back up to the surface. Perhaps Keto had picked up on whatever it was that didn't belong down there. For one last double check, Steven went back to the cemeteries with a bouquet of flowers and carefully examined each headstone. For the sake of the police, he sought to provide the most accurate description possible. At last, he gathered his composure and made the call. Something didn't add up, and he knew it would seem crazy to anybody else. How come there were so many new flowers in such an ancient cemetery? The cops, however, were not as readily persuaded by Steven's tale as one would think. Everything sounded utterly absurd, so they assumed it was a hoax call of some kind. At first, Steven was at a loss for what to do, but he eventually resolved not to let this go. They finally dispatched a vehicle when Steven insisted and submitted photos from the hole Keto had made. However, Steven would be in serious danger if he was only messing around. Despite Steven's assurances, the police still didn't believe him. Steven was certain he had made the correct decision in calling them. Keto settled down and stopped barking as they waited for help to come. Keto would respond each time Steven came near the freshly excavated grave. Whatever it was, he definitely did not like it. What, however, could it be? Not even Steven suspected anything. Steven was too interested to resist the temptation to meddle with the other graves before the cops came. To begin, he methodically began clearing a little amount of snow from a single grave. When he understood what was happening, he was so surprised that he gasped. Until that point, he had only looked at the nameplates, so he missed what he saw next. However, it seemed like earth had been placed on the ground over the grave. The lawn was completely bare. What the heck was going on? This was quite strange. This was the case for every single tomb that had flowers placed on it. Something recent had taken place here. The cops then showed up. He needed to fill them in on what was happening and what he had discovered. Something about this situation made him uneasy. Two teenage police officers stepped out of the vehicle, joking and clearly not taking the situation too seriously. But once they had a look at what was going on, their minds would be changed. When the police came to check out the hole Keto had made, Steven had to hold the dog's leash tightly while they looked it over. They couldn't believe their eyes at what they saw. They had no idea why someone would do anything like this, since it had never happened before. But they didn't understand Keto's reaction. There were flowers on the graves, holes in the nameplates, and they all seemed quite new, which Steven related to his earlier discoveries. One of the cops had an epiphany and immediately began to make connections. For some reason, he seemed to have an uncanny sense of what was happening. The floral arrangements unmistakably marked graves. Either someone had to figure out which ones to bury and which ones to dig up, or both. These weren't tombs, they were temporary storage, as shown by the steel containers with holes. The question is, why? For what purpose exactly? The police officers tried to contact the station over the phone to gain permission to either dig up the steel box that Keto had unearthed it further or to cut through the top. Fortunately, they had been foresighted enough to bring the necessary gear. It was inevitable everything would work out. Back at the station, an officer ran the numbers and found that no record of this cemetery could be found anywhere. What this means is that its very existence is counterintuitive, making the current situation both weirder and less difficult to handle. It seemed as though everything was prepared for this sole purpose of hiding things. Likewise, if it didn't exist, there wouldn't be any real graves there. Therefore, the police were free to investigate the situation in whatever way they saw fit. And this was approved by the station. Those responsible for this clearly didn't want their actions here exposed to the public. Now then, what was this? While the other cops checked the other graves, one of the officers swiftly retrieved the metal cutter from the vehicle and began cutting a huge hole in the metal box. Still, Steven's primary concern was maintaining Keto's composure. They hadn't figured out why Keto was so tense yet, but they would. The first officer's eyes widened, and he was at a loss for words when he saw the light in the box after the cop had completed his hole. But before he could continue, the silence was abruptly broken by blasting music. The whole thing just made no sense. As soon as the second officer returned, he reported that another vehicle was speeding at them. They needed to capture these folks red-handed if they were involved. They had to get out of sight fast. They didn't know who these folks were, and whether or not they posed a threat. The police vehicle, which had arrived from the opposite direction as the music, was now safely out of sight. Instantaneously, they gathered their belongings and hid in the woods. The whole group was on high alert as Steven kept Keto quiet. Everyone felt the adrenaline pumping through their bodies. Steven hoped desperately that he could silence Keto. Now he was quiet, but how long that would last with this dog was anyone's guess. The automobile was then seen driving up to the cemetery's entrance. They had to wait since they couldn't make out who was in the automobile. The automobile eventually came to a complete halt. 2 people left when the music was turned off. As they did so, they went outside with shovels. The police saw them pause at the map for a moment before making their way to one of the graves. They were clearly complicit in the scheme, and they could now capture the perpetrators red-handed. They were still chill, but that quickly changed when they realized their burial marker had been dug up and another grave had a gaping hole in it. One of them seemed dizzy as he began looking about. The cops could see that the suspects were beginning to panic, so they took immediate action to prevent the suspects from fleeing. They emerged from the woods, guns drawn to make the arrests. The dudes were absolutely at a loss for words as they slowly began to grasp the gravity of the situation. The authorities were very lucky with this capture, since he was the missing link in their investigation. Being so young and fearful of incarceration, these lads were ready to confess to anything in order to get out of prison. So they began chatting. It turned out that this spot wasn't a cemetery after all, rather. It served as a covert hub for moving huge, costly imports that could only be found in the shadows. There were a wide variety of graves filled with boxes since various clients placed different orders. The products were smuggled into the United States by a single group, who then utilized them to construct phony cemeteries where their clients could come and collect their orders at their convenience once their dues are paid. Because who, in their right mind, would disturb a newly dug tomb adorned with flowers? This plan appeared like a stroke of genius. Who else but an inquisitive dog that sniffed about via one of the holes? Keto was the one who unearthed this, therefore he gets credit for being the hero. Keto uncovered some very rare huge cat hides in a hidden storage box. However, they had been stored there for a long time and due to poor craftsmanship, had begun to rot and emit an unpleasant odor. This allowed Keto to find them. Keto and Steven were at the ideal location at the precise moment. The police, with the aid of the 2 customers, have apprehended everyone locally connected to the ring, and they are attempting to get the larger fish as soon as possible. They told Steven they were sorry for making fun of him, since he had found something huge. Even Keto, who also performed well, received a medal. The facts of the case are far from settled, but one thing is certain: Keto is a hero. She had no idea that her efforts had resulted in the incarceration of scores of criminals, making the community a much safer place. There is no one more pleased than Steven,